Hello, and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. I'm Father Gregory Pine, coming at you from Washington, D.C., from the Dominican House of Studies here, just across the street from the Catholic University of America. And, well, I don't know that this needs any introducing insofar as all of you probably know the contents of it better than I. But on Friday, the Holy Father Pope Francis published Traditionis Custodes, which is a Moto Proprio, revisiting the Moto Proprio Summorum Pontificum of 2007 of Pope Benedict XVI. And it envisions changes in the practice or in the kind of permissions, I suppose, given for celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, or the extraordinary form, or the old use, as it is described in a variety of different names. So I thought that for this episode, we could just look at that a little bit and then look at the reaction to that a little bit. And I can just admit to having only read a handful of things and having kind of curated the things that I read. So, I think since that day, many people have felt many things, and as a result of which, we're kind of in a position where we're just trying to make sense, one, of what's at stake, and two, of how we envision it going forward. And as a result, maybe now is just a propitious time. Maybe now is a fitting time to just game that out a little bit. So I wrote some things down, so that way I would be more responsible in my describing of the topic and my management of time. And then we have some questions from some patrons, with which we'll follow on immediately. And then I'll try to get as many questions in subsequently, but I apologize if yours isn't answered, just because I have a few already queued up from patrons, and as a result, I'm not sure how many I'm going to get to. So, having preluded sufficiently, let's get to it. When it comes to the traditional Latin Mass and the community that celebrates the traditional Latin Mass, I think that the experience of that community, as I've gathered just kind of in conversations, I celebrate the Dominican Rite in addition to the Novus ordo, and the Dominican Rite is a form of the traditional Latin Mass, but it's one that was codified in the Dominican order in the 1260s, so it antedates the Tridentine Rite by some centuries. So it's kind of like, in a certain way, it's a different thing, and so I'm not going to kind of set up this conversation as something. I'm not kind of like speaking in the person of the community affected by this so much, because I'm in an academic apostolate and I don't have care of a parish where the traditional Latin Mass is celebrated. So I just kind of take it with that approach. But I think it's a good place to start. Is just to start with the experience of those who are most deeply affected by it. And just to organize our thoughts a little bit under three headings. One, I think a lot of people have felt misunderstood, a lot of people have felt suborned, and then a lot of people have felt dispirited. So let's just take each of those in turn and try to do them a little bit of justice. So, misunderstood. Certainly the liturgy is one of those most sensitive and potentially neuralgic points of Catholic life. And, we saw this during the pandemic, that it can be very traumatizing. It can be very, bewildering when the liturgy is upset and when the liturgy is seemingly taken from an individual or taken from a community. And it seems like the way that the document describes the Latin liturgy, there's a specific concern over doctrinal commitments, which we'll treat in turn, and of the kind of divisive tendency, as it were, or as it's been implemented. And I think people who pertain to that community oftentimes don't entertain those thoughts or beliefs, and don't entertain those practices or tendencies. And as a result of which, I think a lot of people, when reading the document, they don't recognize themselves in its texts. And as a result of which, they don't feel seen, they don't feel known, they don't feel loved. And that can be, a difficult place to occupy. The next is suborned. So I think that a lot of people feel like their voice, right, in these matters have been taken from them. And we'll describe a little bit more what it means to have voice in those issues, or just kind of explore that topic a little bit. But, there was a survey that was circulated to bishops, last year, and the results of those surveys were collected and collated, and then this represents the fruit of that. But, it was a survey circulated to bishops who have care of the church's governance, but I think a lot of people wish that their voices had been heard, or wish that they could have in some way contributed to that process or testified to their experience, or felt a greater share or a greater participation in the deliberative process. And not having contributed that, many people feel suborned. So I think that there's a kind of, there's a somewhat schizophrenic movement within the church wherein we speak often of the empowerment of the lay faithful. Lumen Gentium speaks very coherently, very cogently of the, come on, Father Gregory, think words. You got this. Right. So as the universal call to holiness and this fact or this reality that God is calling all to give expression to the graces and charisms proper to their state. And yet here, in the context of the sacred liturgy in which all participate by virtue of baptism, there's this kind of strange feeling of disempowerment, which is tough, is very difficult. And then the third and final thing is I think a lot of people feel dispirited. Right, so when you read the document, you come to the last line and it says that it's effective immediately, which for many, if the contents themselves weren't sufficient, for many feels jarring. Because it wasn't wholly anticipated. Certainly there were whisperings of it, and Pope Francis made mention in a gathering of Italian bishops that something was afoot. But it just kind of, it arrived in our inboxes on Friday morning, and then we're just trying to make sense of it. And it's just, it's tough not to feel sad. And I think especially, here in conversations with people, it comes on the heels of, 2018 with certain clerical abuse scandals, and on the heels of conversations with the German bishops, on the heels of the question about Eucharistic coherence, on the heels of Vatican corruption charges. And I think a lot of people are just of the mind, like, why this, right? Why, with all the things on the table, why this? So I thought that rather than just kind of stay here in this experience, that we could discuss a little bit the substantive ways in which we can contribute to the conversation, or we can host the conversation, if not at the highest level, certainly amongst our peers and our families and our churches, so that we can, please God, make fruitful strides in the direction of fidelity and charity. So I think we should just kind of take it at its face value and asks of the document, what's its point, and what does it say that its point is? It says that it wants to foster unity in the church through unity of liturgical expression in the Roman Rite, and that it seems effectively it's going to do that by consolidating power in the hands of the bishops. Certainly, some bishops are already having conversations among themselves at the level of bishops' conferences as to how they coordinate their efforts. But it seems like the idea is that the bishop would have greater power for consolidating, for coordinating the liturgy in his diocese with respect to these two forms of the Roman Rite. So let's evaluate each in turn. First, fostering unity through unity of liturgical expression. So just to treat briefly the present polemics, the way in which this has been argued in, popular media, just in the past couple of days, there's concern over certain voices in the TLM community who seem to threaten the unity of the church. So how so? Well, there's a sense by some who would, kind of style themselves as opposed to these parallel liturgical forms, that difference of ritual expression sets up a kind of parallel church, which church self-styles after the manner of more excellent, more pure, more holy, more ... Okay. And then they'll have this associated with certain doctrinal concerns. So about the legitimacy of the papacy, about the legitimacy of the Second Vatican Council, about the legitimacy of the Novus Ordo. And I think that with respect to these present polemics, we have to ask ourselves, is this true? Okay. And then how do we assess it? So is this true, and how do we assess it? Because there's plenty of anecdotal evidence, and in the internet, where it's possible to search for what anyone says ever, there can be a temptation to think, like, I found this, that, and the other article, and as a result of which these are representative voices in the movement itself. But I don't know how indicative that is. And certainly among Latin Mass-going Catholics or TLM-going Catholics, there's no, parallel hierarchy. There's no parallel synod whereby their opinions are consolidated and subsequently expressed at a public platform. So you're always just going to have kind of anecdotal points or anecdotal voices weighing in on issues. And those points are magnified or those points are made more visible by the following or by whatever means the person has at their disposal or at his or her disposal. So I think that just kind of bringing into focus the problem of evaluating present polemics and of assessing, are there real problems? with this notion of a parallel church? Are there real problems with, doctrinal assent to present papacy, to the Second Vatican Council, to the Novus Ordo? If there are real problems, like how do we evaluate that, right? And how would we garner consent among the faithful? So in recent years, there's been, in the past few papacies, there's been an emphasis on synods, bringing people together to hear their story, right? To host conversations among people of this sort. And maybe, there isn't to be a synod on the highest level, a synod of ritual expressions, right? Or a synod of the two forms of the Roman Rite. But I think that we can experience, or we can try to cultivate something of that exchange on a local level, right? So an example of which is, and I might treat this in subsequent questions, somebody just sent me an email and said, okay, I hear a lot about cross-fertilization. It's good that the two coexist so that there be some kind of helpful adaptation of both, perhaps, in a foreseen future. But the person asked me, a lot of the things that you hear about the Novus Ordo that are good are things that are already present in the TLM. So what's actually good about the Novus Ordo? Which I think is a great question, and I may choose to answer that in what follows, which I did in email form. But I think that those are the types of conversations which it's actually helpful to have, because they help us to have real, genuine, and substantive exchanges. Okay. The next thing concerns the theological notion of unity, right? So unity isn't just something that we have immediate access to, in the sense that it's like, I know the word unity, I know how to pronounce it, I know basically what it signifies. If I were to look it up in Merriam-Webster's, I wouldn't be surprised by the definition. And so I know how to go about bringing unity. It seems to be the case, well, certainly in the 20th century, that this big focus on unity is coexisting with diversity in the context of communion. So when the Council Fathers choose to describe the nature of the church, right, in the document Lumen Gentium, which is the dogmatic constitution on the Church of the Second Vatican Council, the first dogmatic constitution or conciliar document dedicated to the Church, kind of in deliberate fashion. There was one drafted, I think, for the First Vatican Council, but that council was interrupted in 1871. So when it begins describing the Church, it begins by describing the Church's sacramentality and the nature of the Church's communion. And in its description of the nature of the church as communion, it highlights these parallel aspects of unity and diversity. And certainly ritual diversity is something with which we are already accustomed in the Catholic Church, insofar as there are something like, 22 rites in 6 different ritual families in the church. When you think about, all these different rites that you've certainly heard of, like Melkite and Maronite and Syro-Malankar, and etc. Right? So we already have an experience of ritual diversity, but oftentimes the historical reasons for that ritual diversity are as particular as are those particular churches. So within the Roman Rite, there have existed parallel forms or ritual diversity within the Roman Rite itself, but it's typically been associated with locale or with communities. So locale being like the Ambrosian Rite, which is celebrated in Milan, or the Sarum Rite, which would have been proper to the British Isles. Or local communities like religious orders, so like the Dominican Rite, for instance, or the Benedictine Rite, or the Carmelite Rite. So when Pope St. Pius V consolidated the Roman Liturgy and the Tridentine Rite, which would have been promulgated after the Council of Trent, right? So the Council of Trent lasts from the mid-1540s to the mid-1560s over the course of 3 interrupted periods of meeting. And then Pope St. Pius V reigns from 1566 to 1572, and he promulgates the rite. And what he does at that time is he says, if your rite has not been in existence for in excess of 200 years, it is hereby abrogated and consolidated in this rite. So there's a recognition there that there already is a diversity of Roman rites. This one represents as a consolidated form, but it still allows for a kind of diversity within the church. So like the Dominican Rite had been in use at that point for some 300 years. So there you have it. It still exists today. So I think that like having a sense for ritual diversity, even ritual diversity within the Roman Rite, helps us to understand a little bit better the present context. But the situation since Summorum Pontificum is novel in the sense that you have a twofold expression of a universal Roman Rite, foreseen as universal, right? So that is a kind of wrinkle, and that should be part of the conversation. And the question is how to conduct that conversation, or in what way that conversation is to proceed. So those are some principles. I hope to have answered some questions, but I also hope to have raised certain questions, not just in an evasive way, but because I think that it's genuinely fruitful to have this kind of conversation. Okay, next point, consolidation. So consolidation of the power kind of over who has the faculty to celebrate and who has the right to kind of assist at. This concerns church discipline. So while there are some doctrinal considerations to be sussed out, this is effectively, it seems to me, a prudential matter. A prudential matter which is conducted on the highest levels, right? So it's not just, you could get vanilla ice cream, you could get chocolate ice cream in that sense. But it's not a matter of, it doesn't strike me as kind of like recontextualizing or redefining dogma. So there are certainly, in the contemporary church, there are concerns about both doctrinal and disciplinary matters. So, like the hubbub over Amoris Laetitia, concerns doctrinal matters. It's not just disciplinary in the sense that, it concerns the normative practice of distribution of Holy Communion to those known to be divorced and remarried. So that is a practice. That is something that one is doing in sacramental praxis. But it concerns the nature of the life of grace. It concerns the nature of Christian communion. It concerns the nature of the purpose for which the sacraments were instituted and why they're administered. So it's actually a doctrinal issue. Like the matter that kind of cropped up, it's almost a year ago now, where Pope Francis said something about same-sex unions, not in terms of redefining marriage, but in terms of some civil recognition for same-sex unions. That would also be a prudential matter, but that's even further, as it were, from the heart of the matter, insofar as that's a matter of how the state could conduct itself. So that's the church kind of speaking prophetically to the state and saying this, that, or the other thing is better or worse. And I think that many people are of the mind that the kind of encouraging civil approbation of same-sex unions is imprudent. So it would be a bad exercise of a prudential consideration, right? So here, just kind of trying to suss out what's properly doctrinal, what's properly disciplinary, what's kind of more proximate to the doctrinal, and what's kind of even further afield. So this present example, it pertains to prudence insofar as it's a disciplinary issue. And the organization of the liturgy is something that historically, pertains to the Holy Father. So we just talked about Pope St. Pius V and the consolidation of the Roman liturgy in the years following the Council of Trent. But then also, think about Pope Paul VI and the Novus Ordo and what that entailed. So I think that there, we want to recognize the legitimacy of that. And somebody asked me the question whether or not you have to see that liturgy as inspired by the Holy Spirit. I mean, inspired can be said in many ways, but you have to see it certainly as willed by God insofar as it goes through the ordinary means whereby God makes himself known through his vicar in the context of the church's conciliar deliberation. So we're bound to accept the legitimacy of the Novus Ordo, not just the legitimacy, but the fact of it being holy, good, sanctifying, and in the present context or in the present situation, kind of normative for the celebration of the liturgy in the West. But when you think about things in that liturgy that change, there are some significant things. I think the most significant of which would be the changing of the words of consecration. When you think about getting to the very heart of the sacramental form and matter, I don't know that you can get any closer, right? Except perhaps by changing the Eucharistic elements. So there's real change that takes place in this, and Paul VI, legitimately exercises his munus as the vicar of Christ to do just that. So here, what we're dealing with here in Traditionis Custodes is, it seems to me, less shocking or less significant than what happens in 1970 and the promulgation of the new liturgy. So again, just kind of setting up the question. So then what is particular to this? I think that a lot of people have found the liturgical life of the past 50 plus years to be bewildering or bemusing or, perhaps even just simply confusing because of this kind of note of rupture, as it were, that we've kind of been talking around but not necessarily talking to. So the changes to the liturgy in Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the constitution of the Second Vatican Council on the liturgy, they're more significant or they're more sweeping than what had gone on before. So there had been changes to the liturgy in the 100 years before the Second Vatican Council. You can think about like the addition of the Leonine, or like of the prayers at the foot of the altar, or the Leonine prayers and thanksgiving. Or you can think about kind of the entrance of certain dialogical elements into the liturgy that might not have been present previously. Or reforms in the church calendar. All right, so saints get added, saints get dropped. It's a rather common occurrence, lest the calendar itself become overburdened with too many interruptions to the ordinary cycle. So there's big changes afoot here in the Novus Ordo. But what's most disruptive, I think, to the life of the church is that the implementation of those changes, it seems, is very ideologically charged. Is it more ideologically charged than in past ages? It's really hard to say because I don't have the historical wherewithal to make that assessment. But because it corresponds with, you think about the year 1968 in Europe, you think about the sexual revolution in the United States, you think about, throughout the world, but especially in our own experience here. And then that corresponds with changes in the liturgy, so it's a very uncertain time, and as a result of which some of that uncertainty gets imported into the implementation of these liturgical changes. And there's just a kind of lingering fear of rupture, right? Which I think informs some of the fears of those who have difficulty, with the new liturgy in one way, shape, or form. So I think that sometimes the tendency when describing these issues is to then politicize them. And I'm not being naive in saying that there aren't political elements to these considerations, because there almost always are. But I think that we should be leery of, kind of falling into certain hardline tropes of one sort or another, just attacking this individual or attacking this community for reasons which are more politically informed than which evince a sensitivity to the desires, the deeply held values of those who are agents or actors in these considerations. So I think that there is a good of order, right? There's a good to the practical order which is being sought, provided that it's done virtuously and then it conduces to virtue. But I think that we can ask, given that this is a disciplinary matter, given that this is a prudential concern, we can ask whether this will in fact lead to unity. Some people have asked, will this be an impetus to a more reverent and worthy celebration of the Novus Ordo, which I think is a good question. We can talk about that because I know that there's a question from a patron about that. But I think that there are also considerations to be entertained about ecclesiology or about church membership. One thing that makes me nervous is this notion of continuity or this notion of rupture. Because rupture is something that we experience in the political process with great frequency, but we like to think that it happens less frequently in the ecclesiastical setting. But people ask the question, will the next pope just reverse the decision? Can it be reversed in a locale? Will it differ from bishop to bishop? What if my bishop approves of it now, but what if he's 73 and he goes out of office? He resigns at 75 and then the next guy's not on board. What is the experience in the priests and of the people in these situations? And is that uncertainty or is that volatility, in fact, a good for the church, for the church's unity? People entertain the question of schism. Will this force out based on doctrinal and liturgical commitments? And I think that, the church is always going to delimit bounds. It's always going to draw a line in the sand. But the question is whether or not the line should be drawn here or here or here or here. And we've seen a lot in the way of pastoral solicitude from St. John Paul II, from Benedict XVI, and from Francis with respect to SSPX, for instance. Wide permissions granted so as to encourage reunification, to encourage the cessation of a schism. So I think, that there's also these considerations to be entertained. But then ultimately, when we talk about unity and consolidating the power of the liturgy in the hands of the bishops, we can just ask simply, is this going to generate Christian communion? Is this going to generate union in the body of Christ that encourages each to contribute to the church in a way proper to his or her state? So I think maybe just as a way to dovetail out of this discussion or to conclude this discussion, just to take that consideration a little further and to revisit the 3 points that I used to introduce the experience of the community most affected by this document, and then just kind of give some encouragement. So steps forward. For those who are misunderstood, I would say just an encouragement not to give in to the caricature. It's easy to feel hurt, right? It's natural to feel hurt, and to be angry and sad, but not to act out of the caricature that we're just angry and sad and we can only ever play the part of the angry and sad. I think that the TLM community can show itself to be intelligent, to be balanced, to be cooperative and engaged in a way that doesn't lead to them being burned by their facilitation of these discussions, but we can actually show a real desire, evince, like a genuine movement towards communion, which will be a light unto the nations. And it also can be an occasion for you to foster a deeper sense of your own kind of self-understanding and Catholicity. So when traumatic things happen, I think that sometimes I'll be on a live stream like this and people will just say something simply like, the Catholic Church can't get its act together. I was thinking about it as a live option for me, but I don't think it's for me anymore, which can be really tough to read. And I imagine even more difficult to experience. So I think in these moments, it's for us to tell the story of why we came and why we stay, and to be encouraged by the witnesses of those who are, who are faithful, who are good. I was driving in the car with Father Patrick Briscoe on Sunday, and he was just reading me some stuff, and he said, Bishop Tobin of Providence said that he was going to assist in choir at the TLM to be held at St. Mary's on Broadway in Providence, Rhode Island, the following Sunday. And just the thought of that, it's like, I think all of us, want pastors who love us. We want pastors who are solicitous for our good, and we can build them up, and we can be built up by them. So that's a reason. And it's a reason that we should repeat. It's a story that we should tell. Next, for those who feel suborned, I think that it's, good to help. It's helpful to keep in mind the fact that the church is a kind of constitutional monarchy, and it's not democratic, right? So we've entertained options whereby those in the church, like who do not pertain to the hierarchy, have tried to exercise control over the hierarchy. You can think about Gallicanism, or Febronianism, or Josephism, or you can think about like lay trusteeship in our own experience in the United States, and it typically doesn't go well, right? So it's not for us to change the nature of the church to make it democratic so that we can feel ourselves to have more of parity in like the decision-making process as it's currently outlined. Rather, it's for us to exercise our ecclesial gifts, which are sometimes called munera, which is the plural for the Latin munus, to exercise our ecclesial gifts properly. So this would be like your priesthood, your prophetic nature, your prophetic office, your kingship. So that means to think and to say and to do those things that are proper to your state, which means to pray, to fast, to make vigil. It means to instruct, admonish, to build up those in your care. It means to engage with the hierarchy in fruitful ways. It means to write to bishops. It means to support the priests, the bishops, the Holy Father, who support you, not just because they support you, but to support them, to build them up, to make, whatever gestures or acts or, things that you can muster, right, as a way by which to build up the church. It's also, people talk about sticking to locale versus the Benedict option. That's still a live debate, and I don't intend to settle it in the course of a 15-second comment, but it's a time for you to build up your community of whichever sort, whether it's a community here in which you're rooted, maybe it's your geographical parish, or maybe it's a parish to which you have kind of migrated because it's a thing in which you want to invest. It's a place where you want to raise your kids, So build up the community to which you pertain. And then third and finally, for the dispirited, I would say simply this, that the Lord has given you what you need to flourish. The Lord has given you what you need to flourish. You are not responsible for what you have not been given. St. Augustine often repeated, God, Lord, I'm combining words now. Lord, give what you command and command what you will. Right? So the Lord gives what he commands, and he commands of you, or he commands you, to do what he wills. So the concrete and particular circumstances of your life represent, in a certain sense, God's will for your life, and your real life is found there. It's not found elsewhere. Right? So you are not being deprived of the things essential for salvation. The Lord has promised to give those to you, and he is true to his word. Okay? So it may be a temptation to kind of, think about your position, your role as that of a victim, but whether or not that's true, you remain a protagonist, right? You remain an actor, you remain an agent, you remain competent to seek holiness, to seek peace, right? And to build up those with whom you live and to whom you're sent. So if at the end of this I've raised more questions than I have answered answers, maybe that's good, maybe that's by design, because I don't think that we're supposed to necessarily solve these issues yesterday so far as we are supposed to continue talking them out, talking them through until such time as we, have the answers, or until such time as we behold the answers in heaven. So that's my word of encouragement. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for listening. I'm going to bop over now and start answering some questions. Okay. So Nathan Alex, who's a patron of Matt's on the channel, he says, I'm a recent convert from Protestantism, and I'm trying to appreciate tradition. But with the silence, it's difficult to focus. Any tips on how to better participate? Yeah, this is a good question, which kind of bridges our approach to both the TLM and the Novus Ordo. And I would say that in Sacrosanctum Concilium, you hear this encouragement to participatio actuosa, right, which is sometimes related or sometimes translated as active participation. I think a more faithful translation is actual participation, which means it goes beyond habitual participation and moves into a kind of engaged, intentional participation. When St. Thomas Aquinas talks about participation in the liturgy, he says that you gain access to the meaning basically by the words. So, provided that you show up and that you intend to assist worthily at Mass, you've kind of laid the groundwork for merit. But then beyond intention, you can also make kind of efforts at attention. So you pay attention to the words, you pay attention to what those words signify, you pay attention to the realities that those words mediate. And that can be as simple as following along in a hand missal or just paying attention to the ritual gestures. Certain things are spoken aloud. You can think about the presidential prayers, as they're sometimes called, like the collect, the secret is not, but then the post-communion prayer, and then the different antiphons, right? So the introit, the offertory, and the communion, and then the readings are proclaimed to be heard, and then oftentimes they're read in translated texts, and then they're preached upon. So those would be things from which you would seek kind of most proximately to benefit. But ultimately, the general movement of the Mass is in ritual participation in the sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ. So the effort is to unite your sacrifice with that of His, and you do that by desiring it, by willing it, by choosing it, as it were. And that's something that may not necessarily have emotional feedback or kickback, right? But it's something that's real nonetheless. So that's from Nathan Alex, one of Matt's patrons. Thanks to his patrons. The next question is from Patrick Jobst. What is the relationship with the recent Moto Proprio, and honestly the previous ones, Summorum Pontificum Ecclesiae Dei, with the papal bull Quo Primum from Pius V in 1570? Pius V is pretty clear that the Tridentine rite is to last for all time. So where does the impetus to limit it come in? It's a great question. I think I haven't read Quo Primum, so I'm understudying on this, and if this betrays, some ignorance, my apologies. But I would say that insofar as, you take your cue from some of the distinctions that we sussed out at the top of the hour, those between kind of dogmatic and then disciplinary concerns, the celebration of the sacred liturgy, it strikes me, falls more properly within the disciplinary. So you wouldn't change the essential features of the rite insofar as our Lord Jesus Christ instituted the sacraments with their form and matter, and, theologically, it's debated as to how much of the liturgical setting, but at least something of it. So then the question would be, how much of it is revisable? And that's a theological opinion on which the Church itself, it doesn't seem to me, has declared solemnly, except that Christ instituted it, okay? But yeah, so that's something that's kind of still being worked out in the Church's tradition. And so Pope St. Pius V, right, he solemnizes the promulgation of this liturgy in particular fashion, but he himself knows that liturgical expression has taken varied forms over the life of the Church as it has kind of passed through 1,500 plus years. And so I don't know what is the nature of the act whereby he solemnizes it, unto ages of ages. So I think that they're helpful considerations of the distinction between the dogmatic and the disciplinary, the doctrinal and the disciplinary, and then of the force of a promulgation of such sort, and then what constitutes revision of the essential and what constitutes revision of the non-essential or accidental. So I think that the answer is probably somewhere to be found in that, but you're going to have to check in with somebody who knows this better than I do. The next question comes from patron Benjamin Handelman, who says, what is the best way to approach our brothers and sisters who are so deeply disturbed by the Moto Proprio that they are encouraging schism? Short answer is I don't know, but I was thinking about this, and, one of the things that I said is, that you tell the stories of why you came and why you stay. And I think that argument sometimes kind of breaks down in these settings, insofar as argument breaks down in most settings, because people don't really so much want to be taught or moralized at or nagged. People need witnesses. And so I think that it's for us to witness to the sanctity of the Church, even at a time where it may be difficult for some people to acknowledge that or to be on board with that. And, I'm just thinking of the parish where I grew up, my parents' parish, celebrates Mass in the Novus Ordo. And I just think of the fidelity of the people there and the way in which that Mass has made them holy. So there's a woman at my parents' parish who's been very sick for going on 2 years now. She has cancer. And my sister was just telling me the story that this woman was being walked up the main aisle of the church. She was kind of like taking some help from her daughter. But the daughter was also occupied with kids and stuff like, so it's just like, it's kind of a hilarious situation, a hilarious liturgical procession to go up to receive Holy Communion. And, when the priest was distributing Holy Communion, this woman being sick and not especially sure-footed at this point, she dropped the Blessed Sacrament. It was during COVID and, there's masks and she was supposed to receive on the hands and everything was what it was. But she dropped the Blessed Sacrament. And so the priest, goes to pick it up, but this woman was already bending down to go pick up the host, which she consumed. And then, at the height of COVID tide, she licks her hand and dabs the ground, right, to pick up particles of the Blessed Sacrament that had perhaps fallen, and then licks her hand again. Right, so this is a woman who has been, worshiping in the Novus Ordo, presumably her whole life, I don't know. And here is a woman, evidently, who understands what it means to love the Blessed Sacrament, who understands what it means to be devout, to take care of the Eucharist. And she learned that in the context of assisting at the Novus Ordo. So it's like, we have these stories to tell, and we should tell these stories, not in a moralizing way, not in a nagging way, right? Not in like a preachy way, says the Order of Preachers member, but in a way that reveals the beauty of Catholic communion, even at a time where it seems, vexed. All right, so that's a great question from Benjamin Handelman. Jack Skian says, while I think this Moto Proprio was imprudent, to say the least, one potential positive effect I think might come from this is much more widespread beauty and reverence in the ordinary form due to the importing of people from traditional parishes. So Matt and Father Pine, are there any unintended positive effects you foresee coming from this document? Right. So the one that you suggest, it may be true. It may cause something of the cross-fertilization which Pope Benedict XVI envisioned in 2007 with the publication of Summorum Pontificum. I think maybe, there are certain goods that are proposed by the Novus Ordo, which I think are good, right? And they are distinct from what is proposed in the context of the TLM, if not, different in kind, at least different in degree. And I think that maybe now is a time to appreciate some of those things, insofar as it can heal wounds. So I think, what are emphases of the Novus Ordo? Like, what are we being encouraged by the Church, by the Second Vatican Council, by the Holy Father to embrace? And I think that a lot of those things we'll find very embraceable indeed. So one is a much expanded lectionary. The fact that you have different readings for every day is a big deal. So for ferial days, you have a 2-year cycle for the first reading in ordinary time, a 1-year cycle for those same readings in Advent, Christmas, Lent, and Easter, and then a 1-year cycle for the Gospel throughout the year. But then for Sundays, you have a 3-year cycle. So you read a lot of Scripture in the Novus Ordo, which is good. And people might come back with the argument, well, is the Mass necessarily the time to read all of Scripture? Right? Those are fruitful conversations to have. But I think that there's this emphasis on the fact that we receive from the altar of the Word, or the table of the Word and the table of the altar, to confuse some metaphors there, right? So this is a good, right? Our engagement with sacred Scripture. Origen says that we should be attentive to the Word, so much so that we should fear lest a word proclaimed drop from our hearing, just as much as we fear that a particle of the Blessed Sacrament drop from the altar. Okay. Another thing is, there's like simple changes which I think enrich the liturgy, like a wider sampling of prefaces. So in the extraordinary form, you're usually just using the common preface. You're using it often and a lot. Whereas in the Novus Ordo, you have many different prefaces, 6 common prefaces, in addition to a variety of other sanctoral prefaces, which highlight different aspects of the Church's theology, the Church's cult of the saints, the Church's liturgical sensibilities, which I think are good and beautiful. Another thing, like the audible canon, right? Again, this will be debated by people. But the fact that the people of God are invited into hearing, right, the words of institution, that they are made present at the sacrifice in a way not unlike the apostles would have been made present at the sacrifice at the Last Supper, is striking. And again, certainly it's debatable whether or not it is better or worse. But I think that you can see what is being kind of outlined or what's envisioned in that change. And then maybe just one more, like a wider permission for vernacular. Obviously, there are permissions for the use of the vernacular in the extraordinary form, but not necessarily with the same care or the same attention. And if done well, the use of these translated texts, it does something for comprehension. which, again, is debatable as to what constitutes comprehension, or what potentially threatens an over-intellectualization or an over-physicalization of the sacraments. But I think that, there's the sense that we're being appealed to as rational animals, and the Novus Ordo seeks to do that. So I think that these are some of the goods that are being proposed, and these are some of the goods towards which, we might profitably incline during this time, as a way by which, to kind of receive the Church's teaching and to interiorize it. So is this a potential good thing that could come about? I don't know. I fear that the Moto Proprio might actually affect the opposite result, which would be further hurt, further alienation. God love us. Right, but these are some of the things which are at stake. Okay. Thank you. So that's Jack Skian. Next, from Eric Music, again, thanks to Matt's patrons. You hear so much from all sides. In layman's terms, what has just happened? I'm in rural Canada, and it's pretty liberal here. We don't have a TLM close enough to get to. However, we do go to one of these rare Novus Ordo that is reverent masses and is, I'll say, decent. For the record, if there was a TLM in the area, I'd be there. So the basic thing is, in Summorum Pontificum, the permission was given to priest and people to celebrate and to request the celebration of the extraordinary form, in a certain sense, irrespective of bishops. Now, oftentimes that was coordinated with the bishop's office, but there was a sense in which both, priest and people were invested with a kind of power, or invested with a kind of responsibility for just that. And as a result of which, many TLM communities cropped up throughout the world, in addition to those that had already been envisioned or provided for by Ecclesia Dei. So if you go online, you can see a kind of mapping of these, and a lot of them are in the United States. It's something like 40% of those sites, those worship sites, are in the United States. I think the next most concentrated area would be France, which are two very different ecclesial situations. But apart from that, you have other places which have it with some frequency, but it's the United States and France are the most affected by it. I want to say that the United States accounts for like 40% of the worship sites in which the TLM is celebrated. So then with this most recent Moto Proprio, Traditionis Custodes, those rights were abrogated. Okay, so now the priest does not ordinarily have the faculty to celebrate except by permission, and the people do not have the right to request it except by special provision, basically, and that's all coordinated through the bishop's office. So maybe I should have started with that at the top by way of clarification, but there you have it. Righteous. Okay, so those are questions from some of Matt's patrons, so thanks so much for your support. And now we're going to go to some questions from other folks. So thanks, guys, for your patience. I'm only going to get to answer a few of these. So thanks for sticking with it and for your contributions nonetheless. All right. Let's just, because we've devoted most of the time to Traditionis Custodes, I'm going to skip through questions to isolate and identify those types of questions so that we can just kind of fill out the hour with just this. So we won't necessarily appeal too terribly much to St. Thomas Aquinas on Pints with Aquinas this particular time, but still I feel like the ecclesial moment merits it. All right, so I'm scrolling. Hey, Servus Marie, usted habla muy bien español. Mil gracias. Okay, that's not about that. Okay. Father, if some exploit the Mass to raise doubts about Vatican II, does not justice warrant the Holy Father directly address and reconcile those doubts instead of restricting the entire Church? Right, so that's a good question. It seems that one of the Holy Father's principal focuses is the acceptance of the teachings and the liturgical changes of the Second Vatican Council. He wants to, ensure, I suppose, or command assent to... he wants to ensure that those teachings are received. How best does one go about this? I think you see in the past three pontificates different ways in which, the Holy Father has gone about this. So you can think about, I think, the pontificate of St. John Paul II as an extended apology for the Second Vatican Council. So St. John Paul II, right, was a council father at the Second Vatican Council, and he has a very vested interest in many of its documents. He was a principal collaborator in many of its deliberations. But the way in which St. John Paul II chose to commend the teaching of the Second Vatican Council was oftentimes to repeat it, right? So to preach it, to testify to it in that way, and then to draw out its implications. So, like, for instance, you can think about Humanae Vitae comes in 1968, so it's not it doesn't pertain directly to the Second Vatican Council, nor does it actually have a kind of neat place into which it slots in the Second Vatican Council. But if you think about the theology of the body as a kind of apology for or theological exposition of Humanae Vitae, it makes much more in beautiful sense. But he does it by a kind of doctrinal accompaniment, as it were, which is one way by which to command assent. But then there's the recognition that even when you do that, some people will still not be moved to assent. So the crisis with Lefebvre comes to fever pitch in the 1980s, right, during the pontificate of St. John Paul II. So then the question becomes, how do you ensure the unity, the integrity of the ecclesial body when there's a threat of, heresy, apostasy, schism, these different kind of wounds that afflict the church? And then there you will get into more kind of issues of disciplinary or even punitive considerations. And I think that what we see here is that the Father is moving more in the order of the disciplinary rather than of the kind of expository. And it's apparently his judgment that that's the best way by which to address it. And you can call into question the prudence of that move. So yes, I think it's very legitimate. I think it's on sound footing to call into question the prudence of that move. All right. So here we go. Austin Sarabia says, what advice do you have for traditional Catholics making the transition back to the Novus Ordo? The Moto Proprio states that the Novus Ordo needs to be recited as intended, but most priests brush off anyone requesting this. Yes, so I think that there are different ways by which to approach it. And I think at this point, it's best to be innocent as doves and crafty as serpents. So I think it's good to get involved in your parish, right? I think a priest is going to be less willing to receive the input from somebody who's not yet involved in his parish. He wants to see that you have a vested interest in it. He wants to see that you contribute to it at every level, right? So if you get involved in, like prayer groups, if you get involved in kind of faith formation groups, if you get involved in, like on Exodus 90, kind of like a penance type group, and you start building up the ecclesial community in that way, I think that a priest will be more receptive to any suggestions or contributions that you have to make in the liturgical, kind of zone. So sacred music is one way in which you can beautify your Mass. And if you have talents that lie in that direction, then now might be a time to offer them, okay? At the very least, you're praying for, you're fasting for, you're making vigil for your parish. You're contributing to your parish in the way that kind of best conduces to its ends. But you're presenting yourself to your priest in such a way that you say, like, I'm docile, I'm humble, I'm able to receive rebuke and correction, I'm able to receive formation and encouragement, but I also have something to give, and I want to give that because I am convinced that God has made me who I am, right? He has seen to it that I be baptized as I have, so that I can testify to his glory in a way that is particular and unique and excellent, and no less essential to the life of the church, right? So you want to make that known, but you want to make it known in a way that can be received. So innocent as doves, crafty as serpents. All right. All right. Paul Pereira says, hi, Father Pine, what are the limits of obedience? For example, if my bishop says no Latin Mass for my parish, can I set up a big tent on my property and invite a priest to say EF Mass for my family? That's awesome. Yeah, great question. So you would want to, I'm assuming that your bishop would probably exclude the celebration thereof, insofar as it's the logical terminus of its exclusion of the celebration of the extraordinary form at your parish. One thing I would say is, for some of you, your bishops have already come out and said what they anticipate for coming weeks, but some of them have also been a little more reticent to pronounce upon the matter until such time as they take counsel and discuss it amongst themselves. So I think now is a time, it's obviously last Friday's news came as a blow, but it needn't be the end of the conversation. And I think that, now is a time to contribute to that conversation insofar as your voice is being solicited, or insofar as your opinion is being solicited. But also, beyond that, it's time to make your desires known, and just to testify to how you've been built up, how you've been encouraged, how you've been formed by the liturgy in which you've come to worship for these past, often in times, 15 years, and for some more. So I think that, so getting back to your question about the limits of obedience, you're bound by ecclesiastical law as a baptized person, and your bishop is your ordinary, and you are bound by his organization of liturgy in your diocese. And unless his provisions are sinful, which in this case I do not think that they are, right? I think we can say with some certainty that they are not sinful, then you are bound by that. So if you were to depart from that, that would represent disobedience, which is, if done with contempt or done maliciously, right, is sinful. So that's a bracing reality, but I think it's what it is. What do I think about this? Yeah, I think that's the most straightforward read. I think that just is the most straightforward read, which is tough, which is really tough. But I think that's where we are. Okay. Sam Piasecki asks, what is the best thing for someone thinking of becoming an FSSP priest to do right now? So I don't know. I don't know exactly how this affects FSSP or like the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest or the canons of St. John Cantius or those whose charism is very much bound up with the celebration of the extraordinary form. It seems like the prohibition that this be done in parochial churches, that no personal churches be set up in addition to what are currently being offered seems to limit the growth and the range, the scope of the activity of those communions or of those oftentimes societies of apostolic life or secular institutes, right? So I don't know, but I think that you want to call a vocation director in the FSSP and ask him how this is affecting his community and what they foresee their next steps being, and that, just ask him candidly how you might best prepare for a vocation which you think involves celebration of the extraordinary form. So that might be a good place to start. So Patty Leather asks, Father, can Catholic priests say the Latin Mass privately in dioceses that have banned it? Can Catholic laity pay priests to provide the service in private chapels? So I think the faculty, it strikes me, this is my reading of the document, and this could be wrong, and this may be clarified, but it strikes me that the faculty to celebrate the extraordinary form for those, diocesan priests who celebrate according to the 1962 Missal, that actually has to be conceded. So they would have to kind of re-up for that faculty from their local ordinary, and that those who are ordained from this point onward will have to seek permission from their local ordinary, which permission will be referred to the Holy See. So they can't celebrate it until such time as the rite is conceded. And then, according to the current dispensation of canon law. And can Catholic laity pay priests to provide the service in private chapels? It strikes me that no. If it's prohibited by the bishop, that strikes me as contrary to the bishop's intention, even if it's not explicitly stated, which I know is a hard answer. And it's just tough. Yeah, it's just what, gosh. Okay. Cordy asks, from what I can tell, the Moto Proprio is more or less a way to punish the SSPX for not actually asking for permission after the olive branch was offered to them. Why involve the whole rite, though? Yeah, I guess I don't understand the ecclesial implications as they pertain to SSPX too terribly much. From what I understand, SSPX is not what is principally envisioned in this, because while SSPX right now has faculties to celebrate like weddings, for instance, marriages, for instance, I think those are conceded basically as a way by which to extend a mercy to the lay faithful who assist at their churches, because it's not understood that they're back yet in full communion. It's just that the longer the schism perdures, and for those people who assist at their parishes, perhaps not fully aware of the ecclesial situation, that their lives are very much, kind of confused, confounded in the sacramental order, unless those priests do have faculties to validly celebrate the sacraments which they administer. So I think it's a different thing concerning the FSPX. Okay. Okay, so there you go. Subsequent clarification about that. Okay. So we have some questions from people about other things. And yeah, and I haven't yet found another one about the Moto Proprio. So maybe I'll just answer a couple of questions about other things. All right, guys. So yes, a couple of questions about other things. Advice on balance between the Liturgy of the Hours and Missal and the Bible. So I think that when approaching these types of questions of Catholic piety, right, you're in a certain sense informed in your practice by what the church proposes and then by what you incline towards. Because I think that you can trust your desires insofar as God is healing them and elevating them by the life of virtue. So what does the church propose? Well, certainly she proposes certain things as, mandatory, like the Holy Mass, for instance, specifically on Sundays. But then she proposes certain things as especially efficacious. So you can think about how the church assigns indulgences to certain acts, which indulgences might include So plenary indulgences, and in order to attain to a plenary indulgence or order to gain a plenary indulgence, you would perform an indulgenced act. And in the ordinary course, there are 4 indulgenced acts which you can perform, any day of the week, any week of the year, which would be reading scripture for 30 minutes, praying the rosary in common, praying the Stations of the Cross in a public church or oratory, or making a visit to the Blessed Sacrament of 30 minutes. So there are certain things which the church says, like, these are most efficacious in the order of merit because they're most efficacious in the order of faith and charity. So I think that we should preference those things in the ordinary course. Now, for some people, the Stations of the Cross just might not be your jam, or the Rosary just might not be your jam. That's okay. You don't have to force yourself to do those things if they don't comport with your own personal liturgical sensibilities, because there should be freedom for expression. And if you're to do all of those things, for instance, as a layperson, that would command a lot of your time, which time I don't think you necessarily have. So you're going to be choosing. Among those things, that you might choose, the Liturgy of the Hours, an especially excellent one, because while it's said by professed religious and priests and deacons, right, it's envisioned to be open to the recitation or the singing of the lay faithful as well. And it's good that the lay faithful participate in that so as to participate in the prayer of the whole church. So those are some helpful considerations in order to answer what you just described. All right. Okay. So there's some questions here about Dominican life, which Dominican life I pertain to. So maybe a word about that. What should one study in college if they wanted to become a Dominican priest, says Elijah Halbert. If you want to become a Dominican priest, right, you can study just about anything under the sun. And I think that, at least for my province, in order to enter, you just have to have a bachelor's degree for those who want to pursue the holy priesthood. But your bachelor's degree can be in anything. And sometimes, you want to be solicitous, you want to prepare most adequately. And in that case, it's good just to go to good liberal arts formation, because the most adequate preparation that you can have for the priesthood is being able to think. And in order to be able to think, it's not good that you specialize too early, right? Think about this in terms of sports. Like LeBron James was a really good football player. Michael Jordan was a really good baseball player. And they continued to play those sports throughout high school. And they ended up being really good basketball players, I suspect in part because they developed their athleticism more broadly. And I think that when it becomes, when it's a matter of becoming a priest, you want to be a good human being, right? Because there's no substitute for a well-formed humanity. You can't just become an expert in administration of the sacraments and preaching and, whatever other priestly duties fall within your compass. You want to be a good human being because grace builds on nature. It doesn't, kind of supply for its absence. I think that you should study those things that you want to study, but maybe a good liberal arts program. I can think of Thomas Aquinas College has great liberal arts formation. Their campus is both in Santa Paula and in Northfield, Massachusetts. But then you also have these excellent Catholic studies programs, like the ones that are at University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Franciscan University of Steubenville, which is I studied. The Humanities and Catholic Culture program there was awesome, and I was super grateful to have had that formation and well formed by it. Okay, boom. At this point, I think I'm going to lapse into silence. So maybe just a couple of final notes on this here issue. I think it's a good time to continue the conversation and a good time to encourage it among your friends, among your family, among the members of your church, as a way by which to foster Catholic communion and as a way by which to grow in sanctity. Because when it comes to growing in sanctity, it matters that you think well and it matters that you love well, and it's easier to love well provided that you think well. But in order to think well, it's requisite of us that we have these kinds of arguments in a civil fashion with substantive exchange, where we're not just kind of bashing into each other angrily, but we're actually seeking, not just dialogue for dialogue's sake, but sussing out good answers, right? Sussing out good solutions in the context of communal deliberation, because we can benefit from the memory and experience of others. We can benefit from the wisdom and knowledge of others. We can benefit from the types of things that come about as a result of the exchange. And I think that that's just the type of thing that we want to do. So if you haven't yet liked this here live stream, please do so because it promotes it in the algorithm and it gets it out to more people. If you haven't yet subscribed to Pints of Aquinas, please do so. And then click on the bell, and that'll force Google to check out other things that you do, or other things that Pints with Aquinas does. And then please do check out Godsplaining, which is a podcast to which I contribute most weeks, which is GODSPLAINING, Godsplaining. And there it's kind of like getting a contemplative view on all things contemporary. So it's just trying to help us to draw out our relationship with God in things as broad-ranging as, struggling with scrupulosity to reading postmodern literature. So that's something that I contribute to with 4 other Dominican friars, but do check that out as well. So thanks so much for tuning in. My prayers are for you. Please pray for me and pray for the church as she advances, please God, from strength to strength unto the praise of his glory. All right, until next time, that's all, and catch you later.